I read an interesting article in Time magazine today about how the Afghanistan election was rigged, and obviously rigged. Many different districts where no one showed up to vote, yet all the ballots showed up anyway. Thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of ballots. And then many other districts where so many more votes were counted than ballots existed. So the fraud was fairly obvious, and Peter Galbraith was basically fired by the UN to cover up that fraud. I don't know why the UN is helping covering up that fraud. There could be some political reasons for that, but it was, in my opinion, fairly damaging to the current people running that operation in the United Nations right now. All right, now joining us to talk about this a little bit more is Bryan Bender. He's written for the Boston Globe, Taliban not main Afghan enemy. Bryan, welcome to the Young Turks.
Glad to be here.
So let's talk about, if the Taliban is not the main enemy in Afghanistan, who is?
Well, I mean, clearly the Taliban is no doubt an enemy of the United States and of the Afghan government, but I think one of the things the Obama administration is grappling with is this question of who is the Taliban. The Taliban has come to mean sort of something very new than what it meant 8 years ago when the U.S. toppled the Taliban government in Afghanistan, led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, who is still at large, people believe, in Pakistan. That movement that had controlled Afghanistan clearly still exists. Some of its leaders are still around, both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, and they are planning and plotting attacks against U.S. forces, against the Afghan government, against NATO troops. But one of the things that the intelligence agencies are trying to figure out is whether or not the whole number of different groups, militias, tribal forces that are also fighting, are really loyal to this Taliban leadership, or whether they are fighting alongside them in cooperation with them out of other reasons, non-ideological reasons, really sort of local reasons, protecting their territory, protecting their smuggling routes. And at least some intelligence officials that I've spoken to have concluded that the vast majority of the fighters, the insurgents in Afghanistan, are not very tied to this Taliban fundamentalist ideology.
Well, all right.
And are fighting for their own reasons.
Well, that has an obvious implication, right? I mean, I'm not sure that it's obvious, but the implication is that if they're not wedded to extremist religious ideology of the Taliban, that they could be bought, right?
Well, I mean, that's clearly something that some of the commanders, including General David Petraeus, who was the commander in Baghdad and in Iraq and is now overseeing both the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that he believes. He believes there are elements that can be peeled off. As somebody I talked to had said, Afghanistan for centuries has been the location of this so-called great game between world powers, the Russians, the British, the Persians, the list goes on. And to play the game, the Afghans have to play. And they always have played throughout history. In other words, outside powers have been able to use some of the groups within Afghanistan to achieve some of their own aims. So the idea is, if you can isolate those groups that are fighting that don't necessarily ascribe not only to the Taliban worldview, but by extension Al-Qaeda, because we know that the Taliban that ruled Afghanistan was pretty tight with Osama bin Laden. We know some of those links are still there. But the idea is maybe we, or the Afghan government, could deal with some of these groups, could buy them off, I guess is the simplest way to put it, to give them some incentive to stop fighting.
I don't have any moral problems with that. I would go forward with that in a blink of an eye. Here's my problem with it. Strategically, to what end? We buy them, and then what do we do with them?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I guess the idea would be, enlisting their cooperation or some level of cooperation with the government in Kabul, the Afghan government, whatever form that takes going forward, enlisting their support, their participation in that government to the point where it's in their interest to not give safe haven and support to the more fundamentalist elements, the more ideological elements like the Taliban leadership and Al-Qaeda to plan and plot their attacks on the West. I think the idea is that you would enlist some of these groups or get them to flip, if you will, to help reach what is so far at least been the more strategic goal of the Obama administration, which is to prevent Afghanistan from again becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda. Now, what we're not talking about is Pakistan, and obviously that is a whole other nut that we have to crack, because a lot of these most hardened individuals and groups are in Pakistan and not in Afghanistan, and we have limited ability to affect what goes on there.
Well, let me address that a little bit, but I want to stick on the main point that we were discussing there, because, look, some people say, hey, let's, Senator Feingold wrote an editorial in the USA Today saying we have to focus on Al-Qaeda globally, and certainly in Pakistan, where most of their leadership is. And we've had debates on the show with people who want to pull out of Afghanistan, and I say, yeah, that's great. I'd like to concentrate on Pakistan too, but one of the ways that you do that is by having troops in Afghanistan, because if you don't, then they'll just flow right back into Afghanistan. Okay, they're not stupid. The only reason they're in Pakistan is because we're in Afghanistan. So, I'm not convinced that withdrawing from Afghanistan helps us in squeezing the guys in Pakistan at all. In fact, I think it'd be counterproductive. First, let me let you address that. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, most military officers who have experience there, diplomats at the State Department, intelligence officials who study this problem would agree with you that, pulling up stakes completely and leaving Afghanistan doesn't help us. It may, to some people, it may be the answer, because they think that whatever we try to achieve there is unachievable or it's unwinnable. But, I think you're right. And, being in Afghanistan does put pressure on some of these areas across the border in Pakistan. But,
see, Bryan, I'm sorry, Bryan, let me just get in there for a second, because how I want to tie this together is, look, if it was a matter of, I think we got to stay as long as it takes to get the guys in Pakistan, and I think we're going to do that by staying in Afghanistan. I could be wrong, but I think that's the right strategy, something along the lines of Vice President Biden's proposal. And earlier, I was in for staying as long as it took to basically unbreak the eggs that we broke in the first place in Afghanistan when we invaded, and set them on a path, because we owed it to the Afghani people after our invasion. I no longer believe that, or I'm certainly getting close to not believing that, because there is no ultimate goal here. What do? We buy off these Taliban guys, or these guys that are not quite Taliban, that are not religious extremists, that just want the money or the territory. Okay, well, great. We buy them off. I'm in favor. That worked in Iraq. And then we hand them off to Hamid Karzai. And that brings us to the very beginning of the interview, when I explained Karzai's government seems to have won through fraud and is an illegitimate government that doesn't have any legitimacy with its people. So it's ultimately a complete waste of time.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who agree with you, that they look at this election and they say, well, do we really even have a partner in Kabul that we could rely on for anything going forward? And a lot of what McChrystal is talking about doing, which is not just adding more American troops, but conducting, I think, what he would call a more comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign, which is not just U.S. forces, but building up the Afghan army, the Afghan police, so that one day the Afghan government could take over some of the security role. But, it's questionable whether you can invest so much in the security forces of a government that, like you said, doesn't have a whole lot of credibility with the people. So I think that's quite risky, a lot of people would say, to spend a lot of money and a lot of resources to try and build up the Afghan government forces. I don't know that there's an alternative.
Yeah, well, the alternative is we try to fight Al-Qaeda and the Mullah Omar faction of the Taliban as much as possible, and then as soon as they're killed, we get the hell out. Because, this supporting and propping up the Karzai government is a losing battle, and it doesn't make any sense. If we had a real partner, then I think it's a real debate and a real interesting discussion. Without a real partner, it seems undoable and unwise. But as usual, that's my opinion. And one more final note on this. I wish somebody would point out that we wasted 7 years under Bush while we did none of this. So,
I mean, some people have. In fact, maybe not as strongly worded as you just put it, but I had an interview about a month ago with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Michael Mullen, who was pretty striking in his description of the situation. He said basically we're starting over in Afghanistan because for so many years the fight has been, I think he uses the words under-resourced. But basically, he's saying that for the last 7 years, much of the last 7 years, we haven't been focused on Afghanistan.
Here's a question.
So it's not a big surprise that we're in the situation that we are.
Here's a big question that I've heard no one ask, Bryan. Is it possible that George W. Bush blew Afghanistan worse than he blew Iraq? And nobody even seems to mention that. Now we're having a conversation about whether Obama's doing something right or wrong. Now, that's a fair discussion because he's the president now, and he's got to find, a way forward here. But we got to realize who's ultimately at fault here for absolutely bungling this war.
Well, I mean, I think in the end, 5-10 years from now, people may look back and look at Afghanistan as far more of a quagmire, far more of a misguided or mis-executed military campaign than they ever considered Iraq. I mean, Iraq has its problems, but for the most part, the Iraqi government is stepping up little by little. There, is a modest amount of security in the country, and it looks like it's on a pretty decent trajectory given what it looked like a couple of years ago. So I think you're right. I think Afghanistan, people made a lot of comparisons between Iraq and Vietnam. I think politically, Afghanistan may be much closer to Vietnam than Iraq ever was. And, Obama's facing what Lyndon Johnson basically faced, a war that he inherited, generals that want to dramatically expand the U.S. military effort there, but not a very clear or at least agreed upon goal of what we're trying to achieve and when we're going to achieve it. So,
all right. Bryan Bender from the Boston Globe, we really enjoyed having this conversation. Thanks for coming on.